Expanding, the Roman state was constantly confronted, not only with new peoples who had not yet known the joy of Roman civilization, but also with endless new gods of these very peoples. And these gods were waiting for a very different fate. Some went into oblivion, some became part of the Roman pantheon, and some claimed to replace, if not replace, then at least lead this Roman pantheon. So in some parts of the Roman Empire, legionaries hung local druids on trees, while at the same time, some residents of the Eternal City, in the heart of the capital, cut off their genitals in honor of the mother goddess from Asia Minor, from the territory of modern Turkey. Of the many cults that sprang up inside late Rome, Christianity became dominant, but it had many competing projects that were not so successful for various reasons. And today we are going to talk about these competitors, about where they came from, and why we celebrate Christmas in the end, and not some day of the great sun with the obligatory stabbing of a ritual bull or eating a festive Veldon steak. Hello everyone, Egger Ziryanov. You are on the Redroom channel, where we talk about the dead, and the dead, about history. And let's talk about the really main alternative to Christianity in Rome during the late Empire, before we come to any Eastern exotics there. Traditional Roman paganism, whose specifics and differences from the religion of the Greeks I talked about in a separate video, coped quite effectively with the role of imperial glue for a long time. The pagan pantheon could safely afford to integrate new gods into itself, either recognizing them as the equivalent of existing deities, or giving them some narrow-minded function, such as the Galli horse goddess Epona changed her simply divine registration and became the Roman horse goddess Epona. From time to time, local cults were destroyed by the Romans, of course, to zero. This happened, as a rule, in the case when these cults threatened the authority of the Roman religion. The fact is that Roman religion and Roman law are inseparable from each other. Jupiter, initially the personification of thunder, lightning, rain, the most important phenomena for the people living with agriculture, very quickly began to embody with himself, first the union of Italians, and then the entire Roman state. The Roman law, the Roman court, and the city of Rome itself are sacred. So, for example, the British Druids were eventually destroyed to zero. Well, simply because, contrary to the laws of the Dindi, they did not just raise talking bears on a separate edge of the forest, but actually performed an important institutional role, judges and predictors. By the way, the role of the predictor, if anything, is more important than it may seem to us now. Divination served not only for jokes on Twitter, but also as a tool for verifying government decisions and important events. It's not bad, for example, to get a good sign of fate before the start of the war, otherwise the people will not understand. And it's not bad, for example, to enlist the favor of augurs fortune-tellers upon coming to power. Otherwise, in case of bad predictions, you can suddenly find out what a self-fulfilling prophecy is. It's better to be friends with oracles, especially if all these oracles are the highest bureaucracy. Friends, regularly, when we talk about the past, we have to destroy various myths. And sometimes I even feel sorry to do this, because I am sure that myths and various legends only benefit a good story, including sometimes, yes, even history as a science. If you are also interested in the past, and at the same time appreciate the flight of fantasy, then pay attention to the series Others, which have been released on Kinopoisk since January 25th. The plot is tied around a young investigator Lik Holtev, who has to unravel a mysterious story. In the city center, a tram and a car almost collided, which Anna allegedly stopped. The investigator thinks that she has unusual abilities, knows how to move objects with the power of thought. Is that so? Is she the only one? What do the gifted use their power for? For a demonstration of power, or out of good intentions? Who is a certain foreigner Newman, who after the incident, begins to look for Anna? And why would he do that? You can find out the answers to these questions by watching the series on Kinopoisk. There is an entourage of the 30s and 40s, and people with unusual abilities. In general, a very unusual and extremely original historical fantasy. I am sure that there are many fans of this genre among my viewers. And if you belong to them, and it seemed to you that you have already heard other names, it did not seem to you. It's a whole fantasy franchise. Telekinesis and telepathy, the atmosphere of the middle of the last century, self-search, detective elements. adventures and history. I'm sure it will be interesting. By the way, with a Yandex Plus subscription, not only thousands of other movies and TV series will be available to you, but also many cool podcasts and tracks. In addition, you can even add up to 3 close people to your subscription and receive cashback with plus points that can be spent in Yandex services. And with my promo code, you will get as much as 45 days of subscription to Yandex. Plus it's free. Use and watch others on Kinopoisk with me. However, there were a number of cults that had organizing power and at the same time quietly existed within the framework of the Roman state. Moreover, in the late empire, they even began to gain strength, weight, and influence. And how did it happen? The answer to this question lies in the geographical plane, because most of these beliefs were located in the East. In Greece, the Roman religion had no problems because of the identity of the pantheons. In Spain or Britain, local cults were practically suppressed and absorbed into the Roman religion. However, in the Eastern Mediterranean, it was simply very difficult to repeat any of these tricks. Already in antiquity, these regions were too urbanized, too rich, and too densely populated, and that it was possible to do with them the same thing as with beggars and scattered Celtic, say, tribes. Therefore, many local cults have remained virtually untouched. In addition, the civilization of Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor was a hoary antiquity, even for the ancient Greeks and Romans. And even considering the peoples their barbaric, it was obvious to the Hellenes and Romans that in many ways, it was the ancient cultures of the East that were the teachers of the Mediterranean. Then it was believed that Pythagoras studied in Egypt and Babylon. By the way, modern scientists believe that the influence of Eastern science on Western science in the ancient world was significantly overestimated in the ancient world itself, and that the same Greek mathematics, let's say, is quite independent in many ways. But that's not the point. Then, the authority of the East in the West was recognized in one way or another. But Eastern cults, including the early Christians, would hardly have threatened the dominant status of Roman paganism if everything had gone well with the latter. Plutarch, in a dialogue about the decline of the oracles, tells the story of how one day a ship was going from point A to point B, and, sailing past one of the islands, the pilot of this ship was called. He asked what was the matter, and was asked to send messages to another island. The message sounded like this: "The great Pan has died." The pilot complied with the request. The ship sailed to the next island, told the news there, and only crying and wailing were heard in response. This whole story is a story about the death of traditional paganism and the crisis of traditional ideas, about how everything in the world should be arranged in general. As a matter of fact, a well-known mustachioed German will write about a similar crisis after almost 2,000 years. And there will, yes, also feature a deceased deity. And the beginning of our era was indeed an era of decline for Roman paganism. The same Plutarch lived at the end of the 1st century AD, and stated that faith in the classical Zeus, Athena, Aphrodite, was slowly becoming obsolete. Around the same time, Juvenal wondered if there were shadows of the dead, an underground kingdom, a carrier armed with a pole, and black frogs in the depths of the Styx. Even children no longer believe that so many thousands of people can cross the stream in one boat. Such is the engineering problem. If we do not count the grandfathers, and in my time, the sacrifices were more colorful, then there are 2 reasons for all this. In general, the first reason is that Roman paganism, for all its flexibility and adaptability, in general, I'm sorry, is not rubbery. This owl has strength, and the globe, known to the Romans of the Mycumene, is quite large. At the time of Augustus, 50 million people lived in the state. The population of the capital exceeded 1 million. And from the point of view of a state that becomes legitimate through religion, a state whose laws have a kind of divine origin, the religion of these millions of people should be unified, just as the law or the language of office work should be unified. Paganism is well suited for local, regional expansion, but when faced with fortified ancient and exotic beliefs, it easily comes into conflict with them. And it cannot be said that this conflict always wins. Just imagine that somewhere out of the 50 million population of the Roman Empire under Augustus, only 5 million were citizens. And since not all citizens were born Romans, it turns out that the latter did not make up even a tenth of the empire. It is not surprising that the tail began to wag the dog, and that the conquered peoples began to change Rome. By the way, this ratio of citizens to non-citizens is considered, and is often called, one of the factors of the transition from the Republic to the Empire. They say that when you already have 90% of the population deprived of civil rights, then, frankly speaking, it is easiest and in many ways more rational to deprive these same civil rights, and the remaining 10%. The second reason is more curious. Civit, the agricultural community within which Roman paganism originated, had very specific religious requests. The people who made up this community, and the advantages involved in agriculture, had a very simple business with the gods. You send us rain, for example, and we slaughter a goat for you. Such is the barter with the forces of nature. It is not surprising that such relations simply became largely irrelevant for a huge number of residents of the empire, when it spread to almost the entire Mediterranean and began to rapidly urbanize and get rich. For a second, the standard of living of the Roman Empire at the beginning of our era, Europe will catch up only by the 18th, or even by the 19th century. All this led to the fact that traditional social ties began to break, and for a person, his personal life began to become more important than the life of the community, and the traditional problems of agriculture and, consequently, the necessary negotiators with the forces of rain and wind, which were traditionally personified by the Greco-Roman pantheon, regardless of the complexity of the superstructures, began to worry less and less citizens, whose share in the empire was growing all the time. In general, personal tasks have taken the place of collective tasks. First of all, the question of individual salvation. Because even if you are a rich Roman citizen, who turns around like a pig, and coughs up questions, and everything is fine in your life, there is one question that remains unsolvable, the question of the finiteness of this very life. No, the Romans, of course, had the kingdom of Hades, where almost everyone fell indiscriminately. The place was bleak and not particularly attractive. Well, that is, in theory, there was Tartarus for epic sinners, and Elysium for selected heroes, but the average person had even less chance of getting there than reproducing the tricks of Asian circus gymnasts, after 30 years of libations and bacchanalia. Perhaps the only chance to see these places is to play Hades, but, seriously, and the game Hades in antiquity, unfortunately, has not yet been invented. One of the first cults that came from the East, and was going to deal with this stupid problem of human mortality, was the cult of the mother goddess Cybele, the Phrygian goddess of everything divine. There is a well-known legend associated with her appearance in Rome. They say, in the 204th year, a rain of stones fell on the city. We don't know exactly what it was, but we can guess. In response, the Roman authorities, as they usually did, turned to the books of Sibyl's prophecies. Yes, so Roman power was mixed up with magic and religion. And there, naturally, they discovered a prophecy that the great mother of ideas should be brought to the city, and then the city would be saved. By the great mother of ideas, in fact, Cybele was meant. It was believed that she lived on Mount Ida. This is the modern Mount Kis in Turkey. An embassy to Pergamum was organized very quickly, and the king of Pergamum, in response, naturally agreed, he was an ally of Rome, to send a black stone to the city and a white one, which was considered the throne of the goddess. An altar was built around this stone, around the altar of the temple, around the altar and the temple, a whole foreign quarter appeared, where the Romans for literally centuries did not dare to go, even though Cybele continued to be one of the main guardians of the city. But one way or another, the temple of Cybele brought a certain variety to the life of ordinary Romans, because Phrygian priests came there several times a year and staged a real show on the streets of the eternal city. They rode with the faithful through the main streets in sacred chariots, sprinkling themselves with blood, and singing songs in a language unknown to the Romans. It was quite fun, I'm sure. And Cybele, as the goddess of fertility, of all things feminine, and in general, the patroness of the women's website, they sacrificed severed penises, usually sheep, but the highest form of worship for a priest or a believer was to take a sharp stone, cut off his penis, and personally bring it to the white altars, thus swearing to keep eternal loyalty to the goddess. Such is the romance. In any case, no one was interested in this cult for a long time, until the beginning of our era and the heyday of the state. when the Romans and just all kinds of lovers of submissive relationships began to worship this goddess. And then Cybele temples began to appear throughout the empire. And although Cybele as a whole remains a story about pure exoticism, it is worth noting that she offered believers something that, apparently, people began to really need from some point on. Eternal fidelity was not just a beautiful turn. The cult of Key White promised immortality to believers, however, on condition of self-accumulation. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if the parishioners' favorite saying, there was high risks, big rewards. Much more dramatic was the fate of the cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, whose cult not only reached Rome, but in fact was reinvented there. The first ruler of Hellenistic Egypt, Ptolemy Sator, aka Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy Lack, decided one day to create a version of the Egyptian religion that would be understandable to the Greeks. Because, let's be honest, the traditional cults of cats, crocodiles and leeks in other parts of the Mediterranean caused mostly laughter. We can even say that we are dealing in many ways with the author's religion, and even the names of the project developers are well known. This is the famous Egyptian priest Manifesto, who is generally known as the creator, for a second, of the periodization of Egypt by dynasties, and the Greek Timothy Evlampt, who went through everything with Alexander and was familiar with many cults. As a result, Isis and Serapis became the main deities of the new cult. This is such an updated version of Osiris, crossed by Sapis. If anything, the Egyptians began to cross Osiris with Sapes. This is not a Greek perversion. Isis in this cult turned almost into the supreme goddess, who was responsible for the fate of man. As one of the Roman authors wrote, Isis is the past, present, and future. Nature is the mother of things, the lady of the elements, born at the beginning of centuries. And for the Greeks, she became at the same time an analogue of Hera, Aphrodite, Athena, and the goddess of fate Quiet. And Serapis became both Zeus and Hades, that is, the highest male deity in principle, and the judge of the afterlife. The main liturgical texts have been translated into Cain, the main language of the Mediterranean, and if you haven't heard of it, then look at the link in the tips of our videos about global languages. This cult of Ptolemy was actively promoted throughout the region. Already under Sator, the temples of Isis and Serapis appeared in Athens, Antioch, and Syracuse, and then he spread throughout the Mediterranean. If there was a diaspora of Egyptian merchants somewhere, there was also a temple of Isis. Isis even got into the Greek colonies of the Black Sea region, and there the cult went beyond the Greek world, to the territory of the Chernyak culture. For a second, these are the Gothic Slavic lands of modern Ukraine, and the Russian Chernozem region. There were found burials created according to the rules of the cult of Isis, and about 12 of her statuettes from about the 4th century AD. Such is the sudden worship of the Egyptian goddess on the territory of modern Ukraine. The Romans got acquainted with Isis even before the conquest of Egypt, because this cult was well known to the inhabitants of southern Italy. It's funny that the very first mention of him is the Senate's decision to destroy the barbaric cult. And it's even more funny that the Senate has made such a decision 5 times in 10 years. In the 59th, 58th, 53rd, 50th, and 48th years BC, which, in general, very well describes the fruitfulness of this struggle. Then Octavian Augustus, who fought with Cleopatra, tried to fight the cult of Isis. Then the Emperor Tiberius, who had his own troubles with Egypt. But all this struggle was absolutely useless, because despite all the prohibitions, by the 1st century AD, the cult of Sita in Rome had become absolutely mainstream. What attracted people to the cult? The omnipotence of the Egyptian gods. Both the Greek and Roman gods were in one way similar to humans. They could not resist fate, which in the Roman interpretation merged with fortune luck, that is, a force that does not depend on anyone or anything. But the new Egyptian gods did not allow such nonsense. The same Isis commands fate, which means that she is capable of anything at all, including, yes, to defeat death. In the temple of Isis, they promised eternal bliss in the form of merging with the deity, and not only after death, but also during life. However, for this, the neophyte had to undergo a ritual death before joining the believers. At first, he was sprinkled with sacred water allegedly from the Nile itself. Then the neophyte fasted for 10 days. Then he was brought to the temple and Sina. And something was happening there. The Platonic philosopher Bullet, himself a member of the cult, describes it in Metamorphoses as follows. They reached the boundaries of death, crossed the threshold of Proserpine, and returned back, having passed through all the steps. At midnight, I saw the sun in shining splendor, appeared before the gods of the underground and heavenly, and worshipped them close. We don't know exactly what kind of wraith was there if we knew, but we don't. Anyway, whatever it was, it worked. And occultists and siddhas had to plunge into the Tiber River in winter. Yes, of course, you understood correctly, for washing away sins, necessary for gaining immortality later. And yes, since there was ice on the Tiber at times, it was necessary to make special ice holes for bathing. In general, if it seems to you that there is something familiar here, it doesn't seem to you. And if you don't have enough amazing coincidences, then keep one more for Isis. All her fans were equal regardless of their origin. Salvation was obtained through the observance of the commandments. This is a unique story. The cult of Siddha was legalized in Rome under Caligula. By the 1st century AD, the cult of Sidoi had spread throughout the empire. Temples stood even in Germany, on the Rhine limes. And the Emperor Domitian even made it something of an official cult. At least, the emperor himself managed to be portrayed in the image of an Egyptian pharaoh. Globally, the cult of Sid could not take root, first of all, because it retained its Egyptian entourage until the very end. And it was too oriental, too repulsive, too specific to really attract new believers en masse. And to become the dominant religion in Rome. But they would have rebranded in time, maybe now in Rome, instead of St. Peter's Cathedral. There would be some other interesting structure. However, the early Christians really had a lot of similarities with another ancient Eastern cult. By the way, it's really very ancient. We once wrote about it in a cart. Subscribe to our Telegram channel if you still haven't done so. I'm talking about the cult of Mithras. So, Mitra is a character who came from an incredible antiquity. There is a myth that he was born out of a rock. And this is one of the most archaic mythological plots in the culture of the Iranian peoples. He is mentioned in the Indian Vedas in the 2nd millennium BC, and closer to the time we are talking about today. The worship of Mitri turned into one of the branches of Zoroastrianism, about which, by the way, we had a separate video. See the link in the tips. Even at a very ancient stage, Mithras was something like a god of law, whose name could be sworn by some Persian princes, thanks to whom the cult got to Asia Minor. In the Hellenistic states of Asia Minor, Greek, Persian, and whatever other culture was mixed like in a hellish blender. So in some kingdoms, Mitra became the main god. In the troops of the king of Pontus Mithridates, the 6th Eupator, priests, magicians sang the funeral of the slain soldiers. Addressing the judge of souls Mitri, King Comagan and Antiochus was the first to install a huge statue in honor of Nitor Apollo on Mount Nemrudak in southern Turkey. And then, at the beginning of the 1st century AD, Mitroism penetrated Rome. In fact, unlike Siddha's case, we don't know exactly how this happened. The most common version, which for example, is retold by Plutarch, is as follows. The Cilician pirates worshipped Mitri. Their god of law became something, apparently, like a god of concepts. Since pirates are criminals, they worshipped Mitri secretly, and the cult took the form of a kind of mystical secret meeting, with temples and caves. Then these same pirates were defeated by the Roman commander Gnaeus Pompey, caught and enslaved. And so these Cilician slaves brought cult Mitras to Italy. This is the most common version among historians, but not the only one. In the end, all the Mitroist states of Malaysia were eventually captured by Rome, and Rome waged long bloody wars with the same Mithridates, which, by the way, we also had a video about. So there was time to study the enemy, and since the time of Octavian Augustus, the inhabitants of the East had already served in the Roman army themselves. Mitroism spread explosively. By the 2nd century AD, according to archaeology, there were dozens of Mitra sanctuaries only on the territory of Italy. And dozens more were located throughout the rest of the Roman Empire, on the Rhine, on the Danube, on the British Isles, wherever. Well, how explosive. There was one problem with this cult. It is not for nothing that I mentioned that the cult of Mithras originated within the structures of the Roman army, because it remained primarily a secret cult of warriors. Most of Mitra's followers were active or former legionnaires, and the idea of Mitra as the god of order fell very well on the army realities, representing the faithful, as the parishioners were called, as warriors of light and paladins of good. This probably sounded especially good in the context of Rome during the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire was falling apart from civil wars and barbarian invasions. By the way, universal evil was depicted in Mitroism in the form of a bull, which Mitra killed, and therefore was initiated into the cult of Mitra by stabbing a bull and eating beef. And entering the cult was literally branded with a red-hot iron. And all these rites really infuriated the first Christians, who called the dedication beef, blood and red-hot iron, a diabolical parody of communion. But perhaps they were mad in vain. There is a version that almost half of the Christian rituals came from Mitroism. About this, by the way, there was also a separate post in the cart. In short, we know quite a bit about the rites of Mithras. And what we know belongs to the late times, when Christianity already existed, and it's really not clear who borrowed what from whom. So it's difficult to talk about it. But there are really a lot of similarities in rites and rituals. So it is not surprising that Mitroism is often remembered as a legitimate alternative to Christianity, which was only slightly unlucky. After all, many emperors were also from the legions, and therefore many of them were Mitroists. So the cult enjoyed support at the very top. But elitism is good at defending against persecution and bad at mass preaching, you know. So it is not surprising that this closed club and secret teachings for initiates eventually lost the competition to a much more inclusive Christianity. But there was at least one similar cult that still achieved considerable such success. It was a syncretic cult of Sol Invictus, that is, the invincible sun. This cult was introduced as an official emperor by Vrilian in the 274th year. The emperor had just finished the crisis of the 3rd century with great difficulty, putting together a collapsed empire. And he needed to glue this empire together with something. He needed some idea to strengthen, first of all, his personal legitimacy, with which Aurelian had some difficulties. He came from a family of columns, that is, actually serfs, and it is obvious that the option with divine, semi-divine, or at least just noble ancestors did not suit him. I had to follow in the footsteps of a typical anime protagonist. A simple, unremarkable Roman emperor one day finds out that he is the chosen one. Yes, according to legend, during the war with the Palmyra kingdom, a certain local solar boom came to him in a dream, and said that he was taking under his protection. And besides the fact that we have heard this story a million times, there is at least one more reason to doubt it. The fact is that the cult of Sol Invictus is in many ways probably just the senior emperor of Avron, and even probably not quite Eastern. In Roman mythology, there was originally a deity Sol, and Digus, something like Helios, such an ordinary solar god. Even Helios, if anything, was not particularly popular with either the Greeks or the Romans. But during the empire, the cult of the sun was revived. At first it was more of a symbol. The sun, as something eternal, giving light and warmth, it was a good allegory for the imperial power. And in general, a universal symbol for everyone. Even in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh bet on their tone 1,300 years before the birth of Christ. But Eastern ideas were superimposed on the solar Roman cult. In the same Mithraism, there was a concept of Hvar, a mystical light that ensures victory, illuminates power, and serves as a guarantee of success. The monarch, on whom Hvarna descended, was revered by his subjects on a par with the immortal gods. It seems like the first emperor who decided to call Sol, directly compared himself to the sun, was a Neuron. The Neuron was even initiated by the priests of Mitra from Armenia, but all this is more of a prehistory. Because a little later, Emperor Septimius Severus began to use a dedication to Sol Invictus on his coins. But everything is interesting with the North in general. Firstly, he was of Pun origin, that is, a Carthaginian, and secondly, he also became related to the Bayesian family. This is such an Arab nobility from the territory of modern Syria. In other words, he basically had nothing to do with Roman religious culture for most of his life. And he prayed, for example, to the local god Elagabalus, whom the Greeks identified with Helios and called Heliogabalus. By the way, even Elagabal is a romanization of the Arabic Illa Algabal, the god of the mountain. In any case, after Severus, his nephew Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, better known as Heliogabal, tried not only to replace all Roman gods with the cult of Solo Invictus Heliogabalus, but also to declare himself the incarnation of this god. The problem lay in the very mark of Aurelius Heliogabali. He may have been the most unpopular emperor of Rome in the history of the empire. Now it's quite difficult to separate the facts from the black legend, but there are a lot of epic stories and all sorts of stories about him. And he married the sacred Vestals, who cannot even be touched, and rode naked through the streets of Rome, and disguised himself as a woman during orgies, and arranged these orgies in the streets, and took lovers right and left, and executed them, and not only them, also right and left. In short, the decline of morals, and the complete decomposition of bonds. In general, we'll make a separate video about him sometime. Anyway, when he was overthrown and killed, they put a curse of oblivion on him, that is, they actually erased him from the official Roman history. And, by the way, it's hard not to draw a parallel with the same Akhenaten, who was also subjected to oblivion. after all these attempts to establish a single solar cult of his own name. But at least the implementation failed at that time. The idea was good, at least that's what the Emperor Aurelian apparently thought. When in the 274th year, he again approved the cult of the sun as the most important one. Who he was more inspired by, Heliogabalus or the solar deity of solar Palmyra, we do not know for sure. The new solar incarnation in Rome was called Sol Invictus, and proclaimed the new main god. No, Jupiter was left on coins and other things, but he was relegated to the background, and all the solar gods of the empire were declared emanations of the one god. Well, the main holiday Agon Solis was established during the winter solstice. Yes, you understood correctly, this is the 25th of December. Naturally, another emanation, the incarnation of the sun god, was the Roman emperor himself, to which the title was added born of the Lord and God, and which now had to be directly worshipped. Because the emperor is the sun that smites the enemies of the imperium, as the heavenly luminary dispels darkness and evil. And as the sun is invincible, so the emperor is invincible. Since then, emperors have even worn a special ray crown to associate themselves with the sun. And yes, the crown of the god emperor firm, this warhammer of yours, obviously looks like it looks for a reason. My dear lovers of the corpse on the throne. In general, the swing was grandiose, and, probably, it could even work, if not for one thing. Again, the instigator of this whole grandiose idea let down a little, simply because the Emperor Aurelian only ruled for 5 years. Despite the fact that he began his grandiose reform in 274th, as I have already said. And he died already in 275th. Moreover, if you believe the biographies of the Augustans, which I would personally do with great caution, then you can stumble upon a generally amazing story in its stupidity about exactly how this happened. They say that the emperor had a secretary with the wonderful name Eras, who once screwed up very badly. We don't know exactly how, but the death penalty was imposed for this joint. And here, you know, I immediately want to recall the statistics about the fact that as soon as the death penalty appears, it often correlates with an increase in the number of murders, because criminals begin to fear the death penalty and eliminate witnesses. Actually, Eras came to something similar, only he decided, well, that the best way out would be to kill the emperor. And the most amazing thing is that he actually succeeded. He organized a conspiracy, and Aurelian was stabbed during his campaign in Persia. True, the secretary was also eventually killed, but this is an obvious plot twist. And as a result, this whole ambitious plan completely failed. Well, the invincible sun did not become the new main god, despite the fact that this god himself remained. And some Roman emperors even worshipped him later, but you know, it is difficult to make a full-fledged powerful religion out of scraps in just a year, so the cult of Sol Invictus as a whole dissolved into the cults of other solar gods. Emperor Diocletian worshipped Mithras in the form of the invincible sun, Emperor Constantius Chlorus Apollo, and the son of Constantius Chlorus, Emperor Constantine, Jesus Christ. And this is not surprising. Early Christianity was easily mixed with other similar cults, formally monotheistic, focused on rewarding after death, acting as an alternative to traditional Greco-Roman paganism, and coming mainly from the East. Moreover, this happened both in the eyes of observers and in the eyes of believers themselves. And many historians believe that at first, in some regions of the empire, the difference between Christ and the invincible sun dancing on the mounds of enemies was obviously not to be found during the day with fire. The late Roman symbolism found also speaks in favor of this point of view. Emperors were depicted with both a solar aura and a cross. There is even an image of Christ in the image of Saul, with the legends Sol Salutis, Sol Justicia. Excuse my Latin. Well, and we will not forget what the main holiday of the invincible sun turned into over time, the 25th of December, too. The cherry on the cake here was, of course, the Emperor Julian the Apostate, who tried to revive paganism with the help of this very cult of Saul. You know, in the end, he just got Christianity with a different sauce. Yes, this battle was won by the worshippers of the son of the Jewish God. Of course, the reason for its success is a separate big topic. But if we talk about comparison with the aforementioned competitors, I note that Christianity was much closer to the people in the first place. It did not require fans of self-mutilation, like white cultists. It was less exotic and barbaric in appearance than the same white cult, or the cult of Isis. Unlike the Mitroists, Christians preached among all, and not among the elect. And unlike the cult of Sol Invictus, they were not a state project, and made their way, on the contrary, firm below. Halitarianism, appeal to the masses, universality and simplicity of narratives, as well as understandable conditions for the sake of understandable goals, gaining paradise afterlife. I think this is about how you can briefly formulate a list of the main advantages of the religion of a real rock superstar. And especially well, these advantages become visible when you think about what kind of choice did the sufferers of divine patronage have in late Rome in general. There must be a joke somewhere about Better Call Saul. But we are not waiting for divine intervention, but we are waiting for your intervention. Put likes under this video, repost it, write your comments, and you can also interfere in the life of our Busty and Patreon. And support the channel with a ruble or some overseas currency, respectively. Thanks to those who already support us there. Thanks to everyone else who watches these videos. We have returned from vacation, from our holidays, and are ready to get back to business again. I'll see you again soon, and the new video will be released before the end of the month. So I just wish you peace and prosperity.